Good afternoon. What an extraordinary day I think this has been. It really has been extraordinarily stimulating. I was struck by something that somebody said to me casually. They said it was wonderful not to see just the usual faces. There really is a sense of expansion here, I think, of the extraordinary work Declan has done, and many others with him, in Woodlands of Ireland. But that there is a new constituency coming on board, and as an older man, I hope I can say that it was really encouraging to see so many younger people, and particularly younger women, participating and giving really first-class presentations. So that strikes me as that, and the quality of the presentations and the amount I feel we learned was wonderful. Just a few observations. Basically, I'm going to make a few observations, and I'm going to invite the chairs of the other sessions and Declan and Kevin to make some observations as well. It struck me, and we may repeat ourselves, and I think that's a good thing actually, because that means we're kind of getting the same messages. I was interesting to hear the Minister for State, speak, in that you do see that some of the language people who are concerned about the environment have been using for a while is beginning to get traction. Some of the language, unfortunately, it's not really translating into policy in terms of resources. And I'll come back to that in the end. Just another few points I want to pick out were the number of times today I heard the word water linked to woodlands. I think that was really significant, and riparian reforestation. I was also struck by how many times I heard people talk about too little management or too much management, and the dynamic between getting the balance right there. And it's always case specific and how key that is. But we've often seen things too much in black and white, get rid of the grazers or get the grazers in, but it's much trickier than that. Sorry? Okay. The other thing that struck me again was invasive species, and I think we probably need a conference again on invasive species, and particularly rhododendron. It is shameful that in one of our national parks, most of our national parks, but particularly in Killarney, that rhododendron that was cleared is coming back. That is just outrageous and should not be happening. I think another point that came through again and again and again was community, engagement, education. And maybe we need a conference focusing on that as well, with representatives from education and community engagement, and sessions focused on that. I was struck by how often we heard mention of the social, historical, and archaeological value of woodlands, a sense of nature is culture, culture is nature. I think, that idea of a pristine nature untouched by human hands is happily going away, because I think it's very hard for people to identify with, and it's simply not true. Finally, going back to the point of what the Minister said and how we might actually make it happen, for me, the key quote of the day was from John O'Reilly of Greenbelt, when he talked about finding the tipping point that makes the native woodland scheme really attractive to small farmers and landowners. I think that's absolutely critical. If we cannot make it economically viable for people to be stewards of our landscape, it's not going to happen. And that, I think, may be the clarion call as Daniel said, went out today. So that's me. I'm now going to go through the chairs, and first of all, I'd ask Ella McSweeney to sum up very briefly your own session, and again, just give a few points that have struck you about the conference.
I hate going first. Thank you very much. I would say 3 or 4 brief things before I just very quickly sum up the session that I was very privileged to be chair of. The first thing, I suppose, is that I agree with what the Minister said, that the language is getting traction, but I suppose, as everyone knows, that if it's not translated into policy, then what is the point? And you have to judge people not on what they say, but on what they do. And I don't say that in particular, specifically to the minister, but in general. That really, at the end of the day, you have to look where the money is going, and then you'll get a sense of where the policy is. And I think it's really unclear in this particular area that I've certainly reported on myself in my work. Where the money is going is not necessarily where the words are flowing in public, and I suppose that's what the difficulty is. I am still tingling with delight at Alan's amazing presentation there. I just think it's incredible to see what he's done, and it just gives such a sense of positivity and possibility as well. And the session that I looked at was I was chairing was the challenges session. And coming out of that, it was lovely to hear what Alan had done, because the challenges session, obviously we had 4 incredible speakers who looked at 4 different aspects of the kind of big challenges that there are there with regards to meeting the targets in particular with native woodlands. And, you come out of it feeling like some of them are really insurmountable. I mean, Dr. Keith Kirby's threats to tree health, it is just one big long list of difficulties and not knowing and himself being sort of feeling that these are possibly insurmountable, but also that they, the cost of them is in the billions. In many ways, I suppose that is a good thing, in that it means that you really need to tackle them and tackle them quickly. Because what's the point in not tackling them? You're just going to spend an awful lot of money in the end. Dr. Tim Burkett about deer management, Debbie Gillies from True Harvest Seeds, and Laura Bean from Nunso Hardy were part of the session as well. And I got a sense myself that a lot of what they were saying can be summed up by lack of data, which is something that an awful lot of people say to me in this kind of field in Ireland, which is just a lack of data that exists in order to implement either management strategies in relation to Tim's area, which is deer management. For Debbie, lack of data in terms of what's out there. And in her case, in the future, possibly lack of funding as well in order to support what she's doing in trying to make sure to preserve and maintain a seed bank. And from Lars' point of view, the challenges for him in terms of collecting the acorns and making sure there is stock there, and the access to seeds problems that he's had, and predicting the demand being a big issue. But strangely enough, out of the challenges, there does seem a very broad range of challenges there. But then you realise, especially when you hear Alan speak, sometimes we can also see things in a different way. And these solutions, although I don't in any way imagine what you've been through in order to get to that point is simple, it was interesting when you said all that we've done there is keep the deer out. And then you get this response as well from nature. And it's very heartening to hear that. So all in all, I would say 2 key themes that came out of the session that I was involved in was lack of data and also the urgency to tackle these problems.
Thank you very much, Ella. Anya?
Great. Maybe I can use this one, can I? Yeah, great. I was at the what I'd call the ecology session, where we heard about Scots pine and adding to the I suppose the dilemma over whether it's native or not, and the reduction in Scots pine around 15,000 years ago. And there is a site in County Clare where it's persisted throughout all of this time. So it is definitely a native tree. It's persisted here. It never went extinct as such, except that most of the Scots pine that we have now comes from Scottish seed sources. But that was an interesting addition to the ongoing arguments about Scots pine. And another after comment about that talk was that a lot of the Scots pine in Scotland possibly comes from Ireland in the first place anyway, but that was a throwaway comment at the end, so I'd love to know more about that. Then we also heard about cryptogamic botany, which is all of those spore producers, so the algae, the fungi, the bryophytes, the ferns, all the plants that do not produce pollen. And that was really, really eye-opening for me in terms that there are so many organisms that we do not know anything about. We know very, very little about. In particular in Ireland, we seem to be an outlier in terms of a lack of research and data and lists of species there at risk. We have a lot less knowledge than counterparts all over Europe, and we're outliers with, I think, along with Iceland for not having proper lists. And these are really beautiful and weird-looking and amazing things that also have quite an important role in our ecosystems, which are probably quite poorly understood in terms of being the things that make nutrients available to a lot of other things. They break things down and they reclaim things. So that was a really, really nice foray into an unknown realm for me anyway. Then we heard from Declan Little about Brackloon Wood in Mayo and the 80 hectares there and the research and the pollen cores, and I suppose delving back into the history and the management of the wood and how this is a very ancient native woodland, and yet the flora and the composition there is very much determined by management practices thousands of years ago. So archaeological evidence showing up, very early evidence of man's intervention there, and the impacts on the soil, and then that having its impact now in what is growing where. So it's that whole cycling of people and the influence of mankind over thousands and thousands of years. Then we heard from Faith Wilson all about the woodpecker again, which was went extinct here when in the 1800s, I think, came back in 2010, 2011, and how it's the population has been becoming established in the last 10 years, and that's a really lovely good news story. We got amazing photos of the woodpeckers poking out of their nesting holes in various trees around Wicklow. So that was an interesting collection of talks about, I suppose, finer details of ecology of Irish woodlands. And then funnily enough, when we opened up for our 20 minutes of questions and answers and discussion, a lot of the questions were related to policy. We talked about the implementation of various policies and the problems and the challenges that we are seeing in Ireland. To me, that this resonates with the lag time for policy to take effect. So we have got, policies and laws that are in place, but with the absence of resources to implement them, very little is actually recovering on the ground. There are exceptions to that. There was another query about management planning, and again, that's a wider issue of a lack of management planning. So whether that's talking about deer and deer management, or rewilding and strategic zoning for places which we do allow to recover and have exclusion zones, or where we plant up for water quality, which we heard about in the middle session, but a need for management planning and careful strategic decisions around where we're going to guide our policies and our actions. And that's something that we're very much lacking in Ireland because of a lack of resources. And then I suppose at the other end of the spectrum, and this is something that's come through, I think, in a few of the sessions, and certainly in the questions and answers after the ecology session, was community participation and how we really need better engagement from the ground up. And we were talking about the new Waters and Communities Office, how there is funding there for local projects which might involve reforestation, planting up trees, protecting water quality, but all sorts of community engagement projects, and how we can't just wait for the policies and the top-down decisions to filter down to make that difference on the ground, and we need to have ground-up action as well. So I suppose that's a bit of a sum-up of my session.
Thank you very much, Anya. Michael Starrett.
Thanks very much, Paddy. We had a wonderful session. I have to say, 4 great presentations and a really engaged and discursive audience. We started off with John Cross, who was looking at the classification, the character, then Janice Fuller, who looked at farm hedgerows, barriers and connectors. Jonathan Spazzi from Teagasc, who's talking about, can we grow quality timber, and then Ian, who talked in the widest possible terms about education and silviculture. So if I sort of very quickly, just because I'm going to get a second bite at this, and I'll not delay you because I know you're looking to get people involved here, Paddy, as well, run through key points from each of the speakers. John started off. I have to immediately have a go at him because my dulcet northern tones, he hadn't a native woodland in Northern Ireland shown on his map at all, but I mean, I'll let him away with that. But it was a bit of a bitter pill to swallow because I cut my native woodland teeth on wonderful oak wood on the shores of Carlingford Lough and Ross Trevor. So if you're ever interested in going and having a look at a decent wood. John, I'll take you. That's great. Obviously, the essence of classification and management, and John spoke very, very clearly about that. He ran us through the pros and cons, the acidic, the non-acidic, stroke alkaline, and it was just really placing the whole essence of classification in context. We need it. Without it, we're at nothing. Janice talked very clearly, and Paddy has picked up on this as well, the whole cultural connections of hedgerows. And I think it's worth making the point that I think that connection between nature and culture is something that, from the Heritage Council's point of view, where we've always had a responsibility for both natural and cultural heritage, sits very easy with us. And of course, from an ecological perspective, you shouldn't be separating them as well. So the cultural connections that those hedgerows give us have to be emphasised, because that's how you really get people involved in the process. This is also the European Year of Cultural Heritage, and there was a brilliant seminar as part of that talking about the connections between nature and culture in Dublin about a week, 10 days ago, and hopefully there'll be proceedings from that. One of the things as well that came out in that discussion about the hedgerows was the need for champions. I mean, and this, I'll touch more broadly about communication in a minute, but the fact that even Michael Viney was on Saturday's Irish Times talking again about hedgerows and classifications and the importance of data, something to hang on to. Jonathan talked about can we grow decent trees here, and I suppose he was asking the question, and the short answer is yes, we can, and we always have done, and we should just get back to doing it again. He talked about the high growth in comparison, the high growth rates of oak in comparison to other European countries, and of course, yes, we can. We're Federling, if you want a wee bit of somebody that visited here not so very long ago. Ian talked about the woodlands and the way in which they meet diverse needs, and he again touched on the cultural aspect of it. He talked about arts and science, and then it was lovely to hear our Scottish, I've forgotten your name, Alan, talk about those connections as well. The connection of arts and science. Again, the use of the term resilience. But above all, I think what Ian talked about was the context changing, and our approach to education needs to alter and change with that as well. Not just the formal education, but he begged the question, what should be taught? And of course, who else should be involved? And he talked about the public, and he talked about landowners. So in short, education in all its forms is a gap, and there's scope for a future conference to look at that. The whole thing about communication, we all think we can communicate, but we can't. And if we're going to get this narrative across and make it an impact at policy level within government, we need specialist communicators to tell our stories, to get the narrative across. It's no good, and this came out, and I said it at the workshop as well, just bolting it onto my job that I have to then communicate. I need access to specialist communicators, or else the Heritage Council is going nowhere. You need specialist communicators in terms of native woodlands, or else you're not going to get your message across. And finally, grazing. I couldn't not mention it. There is so much talk about the deer and appropriate or inappropriate levels of grazing, and I think there are many solutions. We just have to act on them and make them happen.
Thank you, Michael. Catherine? Yeah. Catherine Farrell.
Hi, everybody. As a sort of a bog woman, it was great to be here with all the woodlanders, the tree people. So it was a really exciting and a really thought-provoking session. I guess the scene was set this morning when the Minister launched the Woodlands and Water, creating new native woodlands to protect and enhance Ireland's water. And that was a really exciting news for me. And I think it really then sort of got everybody thinking in our session, well, this is really important. And not just that it's important, but it's also a way of focusing on woodlands in the wider community as well. So just running through the 4 presentations, we had Dr. Mary Kelly Quinn The focus of our presentation being on riparian woodlands. So I guess for us, we heard about the dramatic loss of riparian woodlands, and I guess while we don't have data from Ireland, studies from other countries suggest that we've lost more than 80% of the riparian woodland. So for a habitat that has a naturally relative low cover, that probably means there's very fiddly bits of good riparian woodland around Ireland. But for something that has a relative low cover, it provides a disproportionate value in terms of all the services, the ecosystem goods and services that it provides. So, I mean, we are aware of things like the biodiversity and stabilizing banks and things like temperature regulation. So we had some discussion around that. And I guess some of the ideas that Mary was sending out was, you know, we don't have to have riparian woodland everywhere. It can be short strips of up to 300 meters can make a 1 degree temperature change for the biodiversity in that stream. Things like having mixed buffers, so you'd have woodland, grasslands and herbaceous borders all mixed up together so that we'd have the best fit. So it was connectivity along the streams, but also connecting up with habitats outside of the streams and the rivers. So that was one of the key aspects that we need to keep in mind when we're working with our water courses, and also that heterogeneity. So it's not like one size fits all or one prescription or one tree species. So again, you know, a lot of people working in riparians would be aware of that, but it was just good to get that consolidated presentation. Again, so getting that all information into management guidelines, so we need to develop guidelines on that. And I suppose her presentation, her final question was, how do we develop payment for these ecosystem goods and services? And fortunately, we had Dr. Tom Nisbet, who talked about how we get payment for ecosystem services. And so Tom is involved in an EU cost action called Woodlands and Water, and I suppose the project title is Payment for Ecosystem Services, Forests for Water. So that's an initiative in the UK that he's involved in from the UK side. So why have this cost action? Well, we need to deliver good ecological status of our rivers and water bodies by 2027. So everyone goes, oh God, that is a big ask. And sure, we realise that in Ireland. So I guess he highlighted the biggest cause being sort of diffuse pollution sources. And I suppose a lot of the time the culprit might... I suppose he highlighted agriculture, but I mean everyone in the room knows that there's lots of different inputs in polluting water. So we all have to work together. So in terms of actually how that project works, he brought us through the nuts and bolts. What was interesting was there's a working group in design and governance, environmental efficiency, cost efficiency and effectiveness. And all of that is wrapped up in this thing called communications. So it's having communications working with the outputs from all of these working groups. And so let's just keep that word, that buzzword, as we go through to the end of my roundup. So I suppose what Tom and that group is looking at is trying to build data. So building these tables that they can actually develop robust systems whereby they can establish payment for ecosystem services. And I guess that was the basis for a lot of our discussions as well. It's like, okay, it's great having, you know, this notion of payment for ecosystem goods and services, but how do we equate that into pounds, shilling and pence? It's really difficult. Nathy from the OPW scared the bejesus out of us. He talked about flooding and how we're all going to be sort of the water levels are going to rise, and everyone momentarily was like, oh no. And so anyway, he brought us through all the wonderful work that the OPW have on their radar in terms of hard engineering solutions. So that's all very interesting, building big walls and all these sorts of things. And then he got to the stuff that we're interested in, natural water retention measures, aka using natural things like woodlands to help mitigate against flooding. So he talked us through a number of case studies, and I suppose that, you know, I guess one of the challenging things there really that he highlighted was you need big areas to deliver small results. So to get a reduction in flooding, you would have to plant significant areas or work with large areas of land. So yeah, again, the key message there, integrated catchment management, and he had some great case studies from the UK outlining how this can actually work. Richard gave us a great presentation about the Kerry Life project, and I guess adapting forest policy and management practices for freshwater pearl mussels. So very real world things like how to trap sediment using in the dry silt traps, which was an interesting term I'd never come across before, and then removing brash from the site. And I guess, you know, the slides are all there, so I really recommend to go and look at these sort of really things that some of us can use in our day-to-day jobs. I guess in terms of the real, I know I have to hurry up, Paddy. It was such a good session, though. The natural...
Everything is on the slides.
Everything is on the slides. I think for the difficulty, again, riparian woodlands important. Woodlands are important for water. But what was missing again was we sort of talked about, you know, the nicety of having community and community there, but there were a few people, members of communities there. But it's, again, how to translate this for people and the communication side of that. Translating the right thing to do for companies or for farmers or for landowners, you've got to get it into pounds, shillings and pence to make it actually the right thing to do, being this is of value for right across the board. When I was doing my background on this, it was sort of to protect rivers, we first protect the mountains, but really what we have to do is to protect the rivers, we first protect and restore and rehabilitate the mountains, the woodlands, the wetlands, and the boglands. So that was, sorry about that, guys, but it was.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you very much to all the chairs. I mean, I don't know how you did it, but you really, I think, got across the essence of a lot of very different and complex presentations. So now, drawing this part of the session to a close before we have I think it's going to have to be a very quick question and answer session afterwards. Daniel, as keynote at the end of the day, have your reflections changed at all? What are your impressions?
We've heard some such wonderful stories, haven't we? I mean, it's been a great day. Yeah, where do you start? I'll just try and grab a few strands. The focus on local country people and how they feel about their surroundings, Declan really brought that up, and it brought me back to time I spent with Mary Tubridy in Clonmacnoise. And, you know, we had a session, a public meeting about what we were up to, and, you know, they listened politely enough as we talked about sedges and sphagnum. But then somebody brought up the meaning of a local place name, you know, was there sedge in that? And you could see people sit up. This was something that they could engage with. Place names. You know, there was something special here. This is our place. Where did that name come from? And that whole thing about, you know, what people are really engaged by. I remember David Webb put something in his book that I thought sounded very patronizing at the time. The Irish are more interested in words than in material things. It's a little overstated, but you see what he means. I mean, words matter, traditions, culture, heritage. If people can see the natural environment and how in relation to their own history and their own place, it makes such a difference. Now, it's hard to keep one's thoughts in any sort of order. I suppose I'm a little challenged by the question of seed banks. Obviously, I see the importance of a seed bank, but what do you do with it? That bit about Stormophilia sweeps away a patch. So somebody wants to go in and plant the seeds of what was there before. Why do they need to do that? Natural succession is a fascinating process. Is there something stopping that natural succession? But our first instinct should not be to go in and plant seeds. Our first instinct should be to let nature take its course. It may be slow, but so what? Two really exciting stories was Faith, the return of the woodpecker. Nobody brought that woodpecker. Nobody facilitated it. I think it's a wonderful story, partly because of that. It did it of its own accord. And the same parallel, the Scots pine story. Nobody set out to save the Scots pine in County Clare, but somehow, amazingly, it seems to have saved itself. Then that story is ongoing. There's a very challenging quotation from Oliver Rackham. Planting is not conservation. Planting is an admission that conservation has failed. Again, it's perhaps an overstatement, but I'd like you to think about it. Now, Keith broadened our horizons in many ways, but let's see, we've the question of also Maria Cullen talking about the lower plants and their importance. Keith talked about the new diseases. Nobody talked about plant pathologists. Plant pathologists are an endangered species. The attrition of mycologists and plant pathologists has been amazing. I mean, is there a job more important in botany than plant pathology? I mean, botany is the most important science. And, plant pathologists are crucial. Where are they? And why aren't we employing more of them? They are needed. I mean, just very simple example. I've just been trying to look at see what certain trees have died from in Killarney. And I realized how hard it is to write a death cert for a tree. You may find the fungus sprouting out of it, but was that the fungus that killed it, or was it a different fungus? And this fungus has simply made way. It's a really important area. Grazing, yes, core issue there. I mean, are we being too cautious, particularly about hunters in public areas? I mean, obviously safety is a priority, but are we restricting the ability to cull deer unrealistically so that there simply aren't enough paid professionals to cull deer? Maybe we should be encouraging culling, obviously within a controlled program by amateurs. And lastly, I'm not going to get off the podium without bringing back invasive aliens again. It's just so important. We need more research, we need more activity, we need to engage better with the voluntary sector. We need more scientific research. I mean, there is an official complaint in the desk of the European Commission, the Environment Unit, concerning habitat deterioration within a national park. There's this huge issue of new areas, particularly in County Mayo, new areas. How are they going to be managed? What are we going to do about, say, what's that phrase, the Frankenstein ecosystems that face us? Maybe I should stop there.
I think we're kind of under the hammer, unfortunately. I'd love you to be able to go on. I think we'll have to. So finally, for this part of this session, Kevin, could I ask you to reflect now on maybe the policy implications of what you've heard today and where we go from here?
Sure.
I pass you that.
And it's, as always, fantastic to step away from the office or whatever else we do and step into this kind of creative atmosphere and all these ideas and flying around, and also, more importantly, perhaps professionals and different people representing different sectors kind of all focus around the same thing. So that kind of came across very, very strongly for me. I loved the whole variety of life encapsulated here. We went from lichens and the very smallest plants right up to Andy's picture of the globe and our place in it. So I think we've pretty much done everything at this stage, but no, we haven't. There's still more to do. I do like, I think the last speaker in terms of the vision of the Caledonian forests coming back and people's role in that process is so uplifting. I mean, it's as if nature will reassert itself. If we just get out of the way, are in places, give it a helping hand. So that I get an awful lot of kind of comfort out of that. That we haven't so change things that nature won't reassert herself in many situations, notwithstanding the rhododendron and some of the other Frankenstein creatures you have to battle with. But having said that, just in terms of policy, I think what I'd like to get across right now is that there is a very strong set of tools there. I mean, it's not as if we're starting from scratch here. We're 18 years into the Native Woodland Scheme. And I just want to come at it from this angle. There are hundreds of sites around the country which have been developed under the scheme. Hundreds of landowners like Catherine, who have really good stories to tell and fantastic sites to show. We went on a kind of a whistle-stop tour, a group of us last year. We do it every 7 or 8 years, I think, where we go back and look at native woodland sites around the country that were funded initially, and blown away. We meet the owners, we meet hopefully the foresters, we also see the woodland as it is at this stage, 16, 17 years on, and absolutely blown away by the wealth of experience there, and also the wealth of real satisfaction among owners. Look what I have. I went into this as kind of pioneers, if you like, and now I have a resource and look at it, and that kind of pride. So I just want to say that there has been an awful lot done, and so not to forget the commitment of landowners and foresters and ecologists who've already invested in bringing us where we are, and to go back and look at those sites and to learn from them, and to look at things like the People's Millennium Forest sites and other things that we've all done. There's a huge amount to be learned from that, and also a huge amount of enthusiasm to be gained from it. We also have the structures in place. There is a mechanism there, the Forest Service, the regulatory side of it, the promotion side of it, the referral process, the various processes that Catherine so kindly pointed out during her talk, which do take time, but they do mean that at the end of the day, we're left with an approval for a project that's good to go and that delivers in many ways. So there is a process and a structure there. I think what's really come out from this day for me is that we've reached the point where we certainly looked forward to, where you had other sectors now believing in native woodland. For example, the EPA regarding the Water Framework Directive and water quality. I've noted down a few here. National Parks and Wildlife, for example, in terms of protecting protected habitats and species. We talked about freshwater pearl mussel and Kerry life. And also the need to link wider landscape habitats and biocorridors. We talked about the OPW and flood mitigation. We talked about inland fisheries and how native woodland can be used to improve fish life. And also, really, really importantly, communities. The idea of communities and individual landowners feeling that connection. And on that score, I think the local officers that have come out from the Water Framework Directive room, if you like, together with the 65 or so professionals who will now be in place, these scientific officers, or stream walkers as you call them, and also the Chagas advisors, who will be actually talking face to face with landowners. And if we can impress on those people the availability of funding for native woodland and the relevance of native woodland, well, we're beginning really to join up the dots, So I think we've reached the point here where now everyone is on the same page in terms of, right, we can do an awful lot with these native woodlands to achieve different agendas. It goes back to a tipping point, and John, I think I have to commend you again for bringing up this whole issue. I think what we've seen to date is people who've engaged in the Native Woodland Scheme have been landowners who have had, kind of almost like an altruistic view, if you like. They want to get involved in something maybe bigger than all of us, and something that will go on beyond and give back to the landscape, give back to ecology and nature and to society. And that's absolutely fantastic. These are the real pioneers that we need to develop the hundreds of projects we've got so far. I think in order to reach this critical mass, we now need to engage with the landowners who aren't in that position, or who need to be convinced financially that this is a good idea. And I think this is where the idea of the Microsoft and Greenbelt Initiative, but also if we can upscale that in terms of the Woodland Fund that's coming out from the Department of Ag midterm review, and to see how we can kind of supercharge or turbocharge the payments under the Native Woodland Scheme to make these landowners tip over into native woodland, because this is where the wealth of progress can be made. And this is probably where we'll actually achieve the scale we need to achieve in order to make sure that this native woodland idea can really make a massive impact in terms of all these different agendas that we're so committed to. So I think that's it really in terms of, so, you know, maybe I kind of came in looking for my kind of opinions to be reinforced, but I am very, very encouraged, enthused that we're at this point. But I just don't want people to lose sight of the effort that's brought us here in terms of the many examples of native woodland creation, restoration and conversion that's already taken place, and what we can learn from that. I'm a great believer in not reinventing things, and to gain as much value as you can from work already done. So hope that's okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And I think I'm going to ask guidance from Hannah and Declan now, because I know we are running late. And it does strike me that there is, for most of us, unfortunately not for me because I've got to go, but for most of you who are staying on this evening and tomorrow, there's plenty of opportunity for further discussion. So I don't know, maybe rather than having 5 minutes rushed question and answer, we should just continue with the programme, and lots of time for question and answer afterwards, if that's okay.
Everybody.